Okay, we've got another question in the front here.
Hi, I'm Mimi Turner. I'm the Group Director of Communications of Northern and Shell. So I've had a little bit of experience with dealing with as much process of Leveson that I've been involved with, and all the various processes that we've been through. And also I had a sort of prior history as a journalist, so I covered quite a lot of the process. What I wanted to do is just ask you a pragmatic question, because ultimately for newspapers, I feel this is going to be at least a pragmatic issue. We've talked a lot about whether Leveson solves some problems or creates problems, but ultimately, I wanted to ask the panel if you have a view on the multiple, in terms of the multiple of the existing cost to be part of the PCC, that this new mechanism that Chris and our editors and, there is a unity of feeling amongst journalists wish to support or to find a way of supporting and are all sort of signed up to. But what multiple do you think is acceptable in terms of cost? Do you think that the same, or 2 times the cost of, or 3 times? It could be 5 times, or 3 to 5 times plus. At what point do you think that newspapers cannot make that agreement work on the pragmatic basis of cost, given that, in the last year, newspaper circulations across the board are down 10%, over 5 years it's 36%. This is going to become a pragmatic issue, and where do you think that multiple...
So what can the struggling industry afford?
Indeed, it will come down to something like that.
Chris?
We pay, I think it's in the order of £250,000 to be in the PCC, and the expectation is that under the new system that would at least double, if not treble. That may not sound like a lot to the people in this room, some of whom work for very big companies, but the point about that is that it's unlikely to be, I've got Russian owners, it's unlikely that they will dip further into their pockets. It'll come off the editorial budget, and an extra £250,000 is about 5 reporters.
Do you think fixed cost? Can you see a fixed cost?
Yeah, and then on top of that we will have arbitration awards. And I've seen some figures crossing my screen recently, even for the Independent, as to what they would cost, how many lawyers we would need. We currently employ, I think, 4 or 5 in-house lawyers, the Independent Evening Standard. We'll be adding to that as it goes through, and the cost of the awards. And we are, whatever people say, and whatever our opponents say, some sections of the press are struggling. I mean, it's true that some make a profit, but those profits are declining, and that is not recognised anywhere.
Ben, you have an overview, obviously, of the industry. Can it afford to take this on?
No, not at all. No. Can't afford an extra £1 in expenses, to be honest, because it's on a downward slope. And newspapers like Chris's depend on, effectively, the depth of pockets of their proprietors, and that's true of Mimi's company as well, I'd say, because the Express Group, actually the Express newspapers do make a profit, but I don't think other newspapers would like to run on quite the same lines that the Express Group does.
Long may they have that choice.
And virtually no newspapers are making, well, certainly not making anywhere near the money that they once did, and I wouldn't put much on the chances of any newspaper group standing on its own at the moment without the support of rich individuals or being cloaked in larger groups. So no, they certainly can't afford any further expenditure.
But just before we move the debate on, any other questions on this area? Yeah, one here at the back and then one behind you. For those of you who can't see, we are on Twitter, #Gorkana on Leveson, and I've just checked there's quite a bit of debate going on there, so if you all go quiet in the audience, I'll call on some of the tweeters to speak up in public instead. Okay, we've got a question up here on this side.
Rafi Mendelsohn from Ketchum. One of the things that we haven't really spoken about that I would love to get the thoughts from the panel is the changing nature of journalism has resulted in more and more, or the consumption of news by the general public, is that there are more news coming from bloggers, on social media, and whether you're for or against statutory regulation, what would be the impact? You mentioned Chris Huhne before, however, correct or not, Guido Fawkes is very much taking the baton and taking that he was the one who sort of brought him down, and was that whether you agree with that or not. But would statutory regulation be able to, like I said, whether you agree with that or not?
He can claim what he likes, but it wasn't him.
Brought down by the news development exposing the fact he had an affair with Karina Trimmingham, and then Isabel Oakeshott of the Sunday Times sticking close to Vicky Price for a long time and persuading her to give an interview. You know, bloggers come and go, and you know the old average. We used to all think they were people sitting in their room in their underpants bashing away at a keyboard. That's certainly changed, and you know I know Paul Staines pretty well, and I think he's just got a column at the Sun, so he's not really a blogger anymore. You know these people.
Sorry. I was just going to say it's a very good point that you raise, because given the commercial pressures I was just talking about, if people like Guido are going to, for instance, run every jot and tittle of the texts that were sent by Chris Huhne's son to him, and actually probably only 2 of those were really necessary to illustrate the story, and the rest were of marginally, you know, varying degrees of intrusiveness and to tragic private grief, then, you know, if he's going to do it, then obviously none of the newspapers are going to be restrained. They can't afford to give him that ground.
I'm not a newspaper person, I'm a lawyer, but I just have an observation, and that is that the responses about how and what the industry can afford sort of suggests that the newspaper industry lives in isolation. It doesn't. You know, I think the biggest challenge that the newspaper industry has is that technology is out there and there is the internet, and you know people can get for free what you're selling, and therefore there are three issues here, and this is what the public are paying for, and they are reliability, credibility and integrity, and unless you can demonstrate you're going to deliver that, you won't be able to differentiate between what people can get for free and what they're willing to pay for.
Okay. Quite a big question whether that's what people actually do pay for,
well,
because of course what they actually pay for in terms of profitable newspapers is quite often something else, isn't it? But anyway, Chris, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, I mean, there is an argument that says that Leveson was a report for the 20th century, not the 21st, and I sort of agree with that, which is it would have been fine if it was in the 1980s or 1970s, but really as a document, it's largely out of touch, and every day as editor of the national newspaper, I'm confronted. I had one recently, I won't mention the name because it's not fair, but actually it was on Guido, where somebody was arrested as part of the Jimmy Savile inquiry, and we knew who this person was because we do know these things, but we didn't publish his name, and it was common gossip as to who it might be. On Guido it went ahead, and then we had a debate in the office saying Guido's named him. What do we do? And constantly we are battling against this, and it's no good just saying people turn to newspapers for reliability and trust. Of course they do, but we're also in a society now that is all about speed of information, and it's not in Leveson. Leveson was a report, fine, as a document 50 years ago, it would have been great, but actually it's out of date already.
Sadly, there were some documents 50 and 30 and 20 years ago, and we, sadly, as a profession, we rather ignored them.
I agree with that point, but I do think it comes back to, and I do think that it's not a document for the future, it is a document for the past. I think there are the issues of the power that the newspapers still have. I think their model has changed, and I don't think either that or what is happening in social media, what is happening in digital media with bloggers, and the fact that individuals have become content creators now and can do a lot of damage to a reputation. And this didn't tackle it at all, and it's such an important part of the media landscape now.
I want to push a bit more on that in a minute, Jane, but let me first, we've got a question waiting up here on the right.
Hi, Dominic McMullen, GE Healthcare. I hope you'll forgive a moment of cheap titillation, but I wanted to take Chris back to the Delaunay and just find out who was chairing the meeting and who was taking minutes.
Well, very sadly, the meeting was chaired by James Harding, so we now have an empty chair. James very kindly took it on, and there was a slightly amusing exchange at the end when none of us had really worked out who was paying for this, and then the comment was made that as he'd landed us in so much trouble and cost us so much money because of Leveson, perhaps Rupert Murdoch should pay. So we did let James pick up the bill. I hope it's not what cost him his job.
Okay, any other questions before we kind of move the conversation on a bit? Yes, good, we've got 2 or 3. So we've got one on the end there, then one in the middle, and then one down here. So if we can keep them quite brisk, and we can get through the questions and get on to the kind of
Hi,
next stage.
my name's Ashley. I'm from the Department for Business. I wanted to ask if you think the public are better off with the Sun on Sunday or the News of the World on balance.
Yeah.
I would say no. We're worse off without the News of the World. I personally believe that the News of the World had to close because of the situation it had got in. If the situation had been properly investigated by the police back in 2005, 2006, it would still be publishing now. And that's a personal point, but a broader point about journalism. If you remember that in the year before the News of the World closed, we exposed the Pakistani match-fixing scandal. Now, that involved having to go into a room with a bunch of gangsters, effectively, with £250,000 in cash and giving it to them in order to get into the circle, in order to expose that story. No other newspaper, before or since, would have either the resources or the tenacity to tackle that sort of journalism. Now, there are many who won't mourn us because of phone hacking, and I entirely understand that. I was hacked myself, and I find that the principle abhorrent. But I think that in terms of big-hitting investigative journalism on that scale, there's no one else that can do it.
Yep. Lady.
Hi, Emma Shepherd from St John Ambulance. I had a question for Chris. Since that famous meeting at the Delaunay, whether 2 months later all editors are still in agreement on the recommendations. And also, I know you mentioned there was a Christmas and that slowed things down, but is there a time frame that is in mind for when the regulatory process will be finalised?
I think journalists, I think the editors are broadly in agreement. There's some jockeying for position and manoeuvring and, dare I say it, things that were agreed at Delaunay over a croissant and bacon rolls, to answer your question earlier. Once we'd left the meeting, some of the agreements quickly broke down. But actually, we are broadly in agreement. I can't think anyone who's speaking out of turn. And as for a timetable, things are moving rapidly. I mean, the thing today that was touched upon by Richard at the beginning, where it is quite significant, if Hacked Off have said now that they're prepared for a Royal Charter, which they apparently did this afternoon. We can get a Royal Charter through very quickly. A Royal Charter, instead of a statute, would have the same effect as a statute. It wouldn't involve MPs crawling all over everything. It's the same thing that governs the Bank of England and Cambridge University and indeed the BBC. And we could get that done pretty quickly. So I can't give a date, I just don't know, but hopefully not too long.
Okay, and there's another question just in front of you down here. Was it someone down here had a question? Okay, yeah, here.
Hi, Lucia Graves, ICAW. What stories have you not run since Leveson? On a Chatham House basis, if you don't mind.
Well, I have to be honest. You have to remember.
This private conversation, Chris.
No, you have to remember. Seriously, I'm the editor of the Independent. We don't really do those sort of stories, so that's my excuse. What I have noticed is that stories are not being done with the same degree, and I mean, even on the Chris Hume thing yesterday, those texts from his son, I can't imagine that there wasn't, certainly at the Independent, there was a huge amount of debate whether we should run them, and I think that was probably true of all papers. We have changed. Stories we're not doing, I don't know. I mean, in all honesty, if a reporter came to me and said they had a story, a sensational story in the public interest, I would think it was in the public interest, but it would involve paying an official, it might involve hacking a phone. If it was in the public interest and I had the clearance of my proprietor and I involved them in it and I went all the way up the chain, I would do it tomorrow, because that to me is more important. Exposing things in the public interest is more important, the most important aspect of what we do. It's not changed anything.
Okay, I'm going to go two more questions, then I'll try and move it on. So we've got one right at the back here, and we've got a woman just behind the column there. So on the left, in the kind of black and white pattern dress, and we've got one at the back as well.
Oh, hi, I'm Rachel Donaghy from Hill and Knowlton. Just very, very briefly, while we're still kind of tortuously kind of agonising over this, is there another country that has got it right? Or is the British psyche so unique that it's not relevant?
Well, Ben? I don't think most other countries don't have a press like ours, to be honest. I mean, you know, our press is the most sort of rambunctious in the world, probably. And in places where there is virtually no press regulation, like the United States, the publications that cause the kind of trouble that led to Leveson are classified as supermarket magazines, and people just don't take them seriously. You know, the issue for the press in this country is that they're taken seriously enough that when they misbehave, it's regarded as a national scandal. Whereas in the States that wouldn't be the case. But I don't think there's a model anywhere. If there was, I'm absolutely certain Lord Leveson would have found it.
Okay. Question at the back.
It's Mark Davis from Camberton. Chris, you just mentioned the text, the Christian text. I was just about to ask you a question about them as you've brought them up already. I'd be interested to know what the thought process was in deciding to publish, because with the exception of the ones that were specifically about speeding, they seem to add nothing to the story other than an element of voyeurism. And they seem to be on exactly the wrong side of the line of audience titillation that Leveson wanted to legislate for, but which the media said it could deal with itself. So on what basis did you decide that it was right to publish?
Well, I've got to correct you there, because I decided it wasn't right to publish.
Sorry.
We didn't publish them, and the reason, I'll be very frank with you, the reason I didn't publish them is that I'm twice married, I've been through divorce, and I knew the damage, the harm it can cause children. And when I read those texts yesterday, I found them very personal, not directed at me, by the way, but I know, you know, I think anyone who's been through that would realise this is very personal stuff. On the other hand, in defence of those papers that did publish them, they were put into court, and you have to look at what happened. What happened was that the prosecution, they had some of the texts from Chris Huhne's son, which were suggesting his guilt. The defence, Chris Huhne, put into court the most damaging texts of all. The very personal stuff was put into court by the defence because they wanted to show that his son was biased in favour of the mother. And that's what happened. They were public. They were published in court. There was no secret. We weren't betraying anybody. I just took the view that it felt very intrusive to me. Other editors took a different view, and I can't knock them for that. They just took a different view. I think ourselves and The Guardian didn't publish them in full. Others did, but they were put into court. They were publicly, they were there. They were available for anyone.
Hey, Graham?
On a legal basis, you're entirely right. The issue here was not a question of an Article 8, Article 10. Is it in the public interest? The texts themselves were published during the course of a criminal trial, and therefore every newspaper was entitled to republish them, and would have had no a potential risk in doing so. The issue actually is quite an interesting one, is that some chose to exercise judgment as to what was perhaps the right thing to do in the circumstances. And that's a very interesting polarity there, because some newspapers chose to expose what they felt was supporting their story, or perhaps for different reasons, and some newspapers chose to be quite sensitive about the issue. I mean, at the root of it all, if one thinks about it, it was about a behaviour that was total hypocrisy and dishonesty by an elected official. And actually there was good cause to say that it was entirely in the public interest to do whatever was appropriate to expose that sort of behaviour. So that's actually something that Leveson perhaps would have supported.
Okay, in the front row.
Michael Davis from Gorkana. A point of minutiae here. The Guardian did actually publish them, but they published them in their live blog. In the newspaper, they may have decided to have taken a different decision. But the point is, can you actually can you make editorial decisions in an immediate news world? And does it?
Ben's the man to answer the question, because that's what he's
I had an on-Twitter row with Dan Roberts about this yesterday afternoon, about the fact that they were publishing them, and I was saying, we eventually did, I think, publish the two that I referred to. Well, I think our view was that Hume had pleaded guilty, so he was admitting his guilt. There was nothing, if it had come out in court, it would have come out in court, and that would have been that. But we took the view that the rest of it wasn't actually speaking to his guilt. It was speaking to the appalling damage that he'd done to his relationship with his son. And the Guardian took a different view, which was that, as I understood it, Dan Roberts was saying that they can't censor what they report. They've got to report what's said in court. I found that a bit specious, to be honest with you. And I took the view that the press should ask itself more often, not what can it do, but what should it do.
The interesting thing is the newspaper then changed its mind in the print publication and didn't do those. So does this exemplify the fact that Leveson really was for the last century, and that that we are now he didn't address the fact that there is live news coverage, there's 24 hours.
Different standards to live social media from print.
What you're seeing every day on a sort of minute by minute, an hour by hour basis is that what's appearing in the digital world is quite different from the print world. And obviously the best example, apart from the one yesterday, the one today in The Guardian, is the Daily Mail, where the Daily Mail website bears no comparison to the newspaper. The fact is the Daily Mail is now the most successful English language news website in the world, and is soaring up the charts. But they are applying two sets of values, one to their print product, which they presumably think is for more staid conservative readers, and then one for online, which is very different. In terms of editorial decisions, we're now taking them all day long. I mean, I'm constantly being asked about online, Twitter, etc., and the pressures are just keep growing.
There's a broader point here, actually, about one of the things that a lot of people have objected to about the excesses of newspapers have actually been quite a lot to do with tone. And as you said, you picked up on stories that that Lord Leveson complained about. I think there were ones in the Daily Mail about Hugh Grant and his family, saying that they were still excessive. One thing that Leveson won't change is the tone of the Daily Mail. And if people think that a sort of a new standard will come in and stop that, it won't.
Jane, can I bring you back in here, because you talked earlier about the importance of trust and accountability. Of course, for public relations, social media, is a huge area where they're advising clients in this era when every company is a media company. What are you advising your members in a post-Leveson world that they need to be thinking about? Has anything changed at all?
I'm not sure in social media we are living in a post-Leveson world. I'm not even sure such a thing exists. We might live in a post-legislative world at some point, but I think aside from the things that we've heard about, the way big stories in the tabloids and in the major newspapers have been covered, I'm not sure it's that much different for everybody else. I would say public relations already has a royal charter. We are the CIPR. It hasn't made it statutory. So you can have a royal charter without it being statutory and without it being compulsory. So the advice we're giving at the moment is that it's a more transparent world online. Funnily enough, it feels like you have more freedom online, you have more freedom in social media, but there's nowhere to hide. And so, for instance, I would give is that when I worked in corporate communications and the Communications Act was going through and I was concerned about foreign ownership, I might have got a call from Gilton, your predecessor at the FT, saying, I want to know about this foreign ownership thing. I might not want to play my hand, but I could have given him background information. I could have put him in touch with people who would give him information that supported what I thought. So I could really lead that. And the story could appear with no mention of me, no mention of my company, no mention of any of those sources, where they come from. You could also have, unattributable sources. And that is very common in newspapers. And people read it and don't think twice.
When
somebody reads something on, I think online it is. I think when someone reads something online, on social media, people are on it like ants in a jam sandwich. It's, they want to know where does this come from and what are the sources, and they tear it apart.
So has the CIPR changed its code at all?
We haven't changed our code. We have a code of conduct that all of our members are accountable to. We're just about to publish a register of all our members, so people can be physically struck off if they don't adhere to that code of conduct. We see that the light is going to be shone on us too, so we think these things are important. But what we have done is we've supplemented the code with specific guidance on use of social media.
Okay.
I was just going to say that the point I sympathise with is that it is not an entirely level playing field. When I gave evidence to the Leveson inquiry, he asked me a question about what does one do about the internet, about new media. And the problem is this, and this is really the challenge. And when people talk about the internet age, it's split in two. It's those publishers on the internet that are based within this jurisdiction will be subject to the laws of this jurisdiction. But those publishers who are outside this jurisdiction are very, very difficult to control, whether they transgress either the laws that may be prevailing in relation to privacy or any new legislation that's brought in by Leveson. And the question is this: how does one confront it? And that's actually that accountability issue is where you come back to perhaps the commercial issues as to what is a reliable, accountable press that has integrity, and whether or not that is something that's sustainable.
You made the transfer from journalism into public relations. Does it feel very different in terms of these issues of accountability and transparency and so on, or is it?
I think there's a digital point that's quite interesting to make, actually. It's one of the things that people associate Twitter with their own personal opinions. Now, when you work for a company, that particularly a communications company, that becomes a much more complex thing because you represent clients. Your primary job is to do what your clients want within an ethical framework laid out by the CIPR. So for instance, if someone within your company tweets something that's that they're annoyed with a company, and that company happens to be part of your structure, that becomes a problem because obviously your commercial clients go, hang on, we pay you to look after our interests, and I think the issue with Twitter is that people view it as very much their own personal feelings. And even if they write at the top, all opinions are my own, not my employer's, your clients don't often see it that way.
Yeah, I can hear.
Mimi Turner again. I just wanted to ask, I mean, this issue about digital, I think is really key to one of the things that we haven't really talked about, but which is about newspapers are defined really by their relationship with their readers. So last September we had a situation with Kate Middleton pictures, Duchess of Cambridge pictures, which were, as far as we were concerned, none of our, we had there was no debate even. We didn't even have the debate about whether those pictures should be published. We'd gone through the issue with the Prince Harry pictures a couple of weeks before. Some papers published them, we didn't publish them. On a Saturday afternoon, just as I was about to go to the supermarket with my daughter, we got the information that the Irish Daily Star, which we have a proprietorial 50% share of, but not editorial or management control, had published those pictures, and all of a sudden we were in a giant situation which affected all of our businesses, many of which are regulated, all of our issues with government, and those pictures, which a newspaper could not have gone anywhere near in this country without risking its would have risked its own ethical issues and its relationship with its readers, and no newspaper could do that. And yet those pictures are massively available. Those pictures were not. So there is a rule, and newspapers, I believe, rule themselves prior to any other external factor based on how they feel readers are going to respond to stories. And yet in the digital world, there is no, there are two clear separate rules for caucuses of opinion and bloggers who might be, sort of individuals.
There's a different set of rules applying according to the audience who wants to pick that up.
There's a clear thing that, you know, the Daily Star in Ireland is a major national publication, part owned by a British company. It was a complete editorial failure by them to even consider publishing it. One of the things that we've talked about the sort of explosion of people can say what they want on the internet and papers are suffering because of it. Papers still have a responsibility to be as careful online as they are in print. That's why I find the Guardian's situation over the emails, over the text messages, total hypocrisy. If you are a mainstream media on the internet, the most popular sites, BBC, Mail Online, these are sites, the Guardian, for instance, people go to because they know they are standard and reliable news. They're not gossip forums. If you are a major publication, therefore, you have a responsibility to think, what will the impact of what I do online or abroad be?
Okay, time for a couple more questions before we get to our final vote again. So who wants to... We've got a guy here and this lady here. Let's go in the front here first and then we'll come to you next.
Okay. Sarah Naylor, Ravenhill Media. I'm just listening with interest about the varying opinions here, and it strikes me that we're in danger of legislating for taste and appetite. There's a broad range of opinion and attitudes in this country. What I wouldn't like to see is a homogenised media. What's your view? Anyone in the panel?
I agree with you. I don't think it's a question of that issue. I think the issue is not about what is published or opinion. I agree that a lot of what one relies upon for the media is about the exercise by them of judgment, and they will live or die commercially by that exercise of judgment. But the statutory underpinning or royal charter or whatever comes out of this is not about that. It's about preventing what could progress into or evolve into illegal behaviour. And that's the difference. So it's more about the safety nets to ensure that there is a proper structure for effective regulation. Whether it's self-regulation with some form of underpinning is another issue, but it has to be effective. So it's not about homogenising or sterilising or preventing appropriate judgment.
Okay, Ben?
I was going to say that it's illustrating the difficulty of legislating for an industry that's as diverse as the newspaper industry, because Chris's paper and my paper, our readers might buy it because we wouldn't publish certain things that are scurrilous or whatever, and other people wouldn't buy a paper because they weren't publishing things that were scurrilous or whatever. But I think overall, the one thing that the newspaper industry hasn't really tried in the last 30 years, I mean, I've been in Fleet Street for 25 years and it's been in recession all that time, is actually being a bit more trusting of its readers and their judgment and their taste, if you like. And I think that, although this is a massive oversimplification, in the 1960s, the Daily Mirror and the Express were both selling around 5 million copies a day. And no newspaper now sells more than 2.6 million copies a day. And whilst you can blame the advent of the internet for some of that, that decline started a long time before Tim Berners-Lee was out of shorts. And therefore, you know, I think that there are other factors at play. And maybe it's that the customers aren't really getting what they want, and the newspaper industry hasn't been able to respond to that.
Okay, question at the back. Yeah.
Hi, James Milton, Rolls-Royce. I was just wondering, there was a point made about the integrity of the newspapers, but I thought that actually any customer is looking for two things from a newspaper. They're looking for speed, and they're looking for an accuracy and a judgment exercised in the story. And then a lot of the time, if you aim for too much speed, the judgment will invariably suffer because you won't be able to make a decision of whether or not you should publish. And I was wondering how you feel newspapers are going to be able to deal with that going forward. How are you going to be able to satisfy both those requirements? Because it seems that they're fundamentally opposed, and it's the things that gives bloggers the sort of advantage that they have.
Speed versus accuracy. 10 years of my life in news channels, but anyway, there we are. I saw a great quote: "If you're first and wrong, you're not first," which I think is a very good quote.
I was just going to say that is actually kind of my job description now. On the live news desk, my job is to make sure that we're fast with something that is A, right, but B, does a little bit more than tell you the fact, but tries to give you the context so that you're not misled by the information that's coming out. And it is absolutely the crux of, and in my view, it's what the future's about for newspapers, because you can't compete with the algorithms of Bloomberg if you're the FT, but you can at least compete with the intelligence that you put on that information.
John Craig, the political correspondent of Sky News, who says, "Sky News never wrong for long," and I think that's. I think as people's taste in newspapers change, people's desire for media hasn't waned, and Ben is absolutely right when he says it. I think there is, to a certain extent, newspaper companies have been too slow to evolve, both commercially and in terms of content. But as we move forward, I think there is increasing reliance in media in whatever form upon it being reliable. Part of the reason that the Leveson inquiry is such a big issue, part of the reason that the Hutton inquiry and what happened at the BBC was such a big issue was, despite all the political rhetoric and everything that goes on, these are fundamental issues, that these are trusted brands that we go to consume and to find out what is going on in the world. And if they're brought into question, it is a majorly important issue.
They have to entertain, though.
Yeah.
You know, and I think we can't forget that is a big part of tabloid newspaper consumption. Is that you're entertained too, and they supplement your consumption of the other media.
And also, there's got to be a question of scale on that. I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, yeah, the Sun still sells 2.6 on a Monday, I think, and you know that is because they are massively popular. One of the reasons that the tabloid press declined was the growth in the supermarket magazines. You know, that Now, Reveal, all these sorts of things. They all exploded because people wanted that simply presented, tabloid-style celebrity news.
Okay. Any last question or two? Yep. The woman in the middle at the back. If you want to squeeze a last question in, put your hand up so I can spot you before.
Hi, it's Amy Grimshaw from Made.com. I don't think I'll ever get this opportunity to ask this question again, so I'm going to take it now. But I wondered why a story as huge as the Jimmy Savile story didn't break earlier. A friend of mine who joined a tabloid several years ago was always taught the way you remember how to spell his surname is with one L, because that's where he's going when he dies. And I think that the tabloid newspapers knew all about this. So, you know, this is of huge interest to the public, of public interest. So why didn't that break earlier? Thanks.
Who wants to have a go?
Graham I've got an opinion about this, but I think it's actually simply two words, and you might have a thought on this, and it's George Carman.
I don't know. I think that if the newspapers can break stories by producing £250,000 in cash in a room in order to get the dishonesty that was going on in professional cricket, and bearing in mind the types of damages that are awarded for defamation, I don't think the chilling effect of prospective court proceedings actually deterred anyone from doing it. I actually think it was much more to do with coming up against what was perceived to be almost an institution, and the fear of, not the financial fear, but the actual, I suppose, reputational fear of getting it wrong or not being able to prove it sufficiently to persuade others. And I'm probably no different to lots of people, that they had heard rumours, perhaps third or fourth or fifth hand, over a number of years. But, you know, I do agree with you. I think one would have hoped that perhaps in an era when the print media was able to and had the resources to go out and actually expose that kind of situation, it might have done it. But who knows why? You can't turn the clock back.
Certainly a valid criticism. I mean, the reason I say George Carman is the fact that the reason the police didn't catch Savile for so long was the fact that he preyed upon young boys and girls who were very vulnerable, who may well not have been believed, who found it very difficult to come forward. And also, Savile preyed in a culture where these people were under no control. And I know that there were several instances where newspapers, I think the Sunday Mirror, put together an investigation into Savile with one of these girls and actually put it to him, and Carman came back with a response that this will cost you £1 million. And when the paper looked at it, they thought, this girl will not stand up in court. So there's a wider issue there about why these vulnerable victims aren't believed. But I would certainly agree it's a failure in journalism that it wasn't exposed until after he was dead.
Also the case, of course, involving Elton John and the alleged rent boy, which really screwed the Sun and cost them more than £1 million. And whether or not that person was ever telling the truth, I don't know. But clearly his evidence wouldn't have stood up, and I think that was a sort of sent a very strong lesson to a lot of tabloid lawyers that that you have to be absolutely dead certain of your primary witness. And sadly, the fact is that the one media organisation in this country that could have exposed Jimmy Savile was the BBC.
Body of proof. So can I just ask, bringing it round again, do you think that Leveson is going to have a chilling effect on journalism?
I think it's having an effect. I hope it's not a chilling effect. I think it's a pity the news of the world has gone. The atmosphere is certainly a lot calmer now. It worries me, though, that there's probably still a lot of wrongdoing going on that isn't being exposed. Yes, I do worry. I do.
Where do you come down?
I think I don't think there's a chilling effect, because I think that the papers are still robust enough to avoid things like politicians leaning on proprietors and things like that to say, you shouldn't run this story and all that kind of thing. I think actually the danger is that what we will have is we will have a deadening effect, and that you will have tittle-tattle on the internet unregulated, and then you will have papers scared to go towards those sorts of stories. And that they will, and that the question of what is in the public interest, which perhaps was too broadly defined, will now be too narrowly defined.
I don't think it will have a chilling effect in the medium term. I agree that life is a little more boring without the news of the world and a little less lucrative for libel lawyers. But I also think it's very interesting that actually other things have led from Leveson. Investigations into the relationships between the police and newspapers, between politicians and newspapers, and those that we assume are in positions of authority that shouldn't be exercising or wielding their power in order to create either money or returns for themselves or influence through the newspapers. I think that some of the byproduct has actually been quite a good thing. I don't think that you can take what has happened over the last 2 or 3 years as being a particularly good indicator of what's likely to evolve in the future. So I think the chilling effect will recede. I think newspapers will continue with their investigation. I mean, some of the areas will obviously perhaps become more balanced. I think the fevered reporting that was associated with exposés that actually had no public interest at all. I mean, do we actually miss some of those? Personally, I don't, even though, as I said before, we earn less money from preventing them. But I actually don't. I think...
Some days are a bit duller, perhaps.
Yeah, maybe a bit duller.
Jane, for the public relations industry, is it a more complicated or difficult environment? Or?
I think this is part of a mosaic that is from expensive scandals of MPs, banking crisis, newspapers, register of lobbyists. There are lots of things happening where people are trying to make sense of that balance of power and have people more accountable. I think this is a sideshow. I think the bigger story is the decline of print newspapers, and I think that's what round the boardroom tables the media owners and the publishing owners really care about. Because that's the thing that's either going to shape the future or not of the businesses.
So Ben, sitting in print but at the cutting edge of live digital reporting, does this make your life more difficult?
No, but then I wasn't really the target of the Leveson report, either personally or
People
institutionally.
can get sued on Twitter.
Well, I'm very careful on Twitter, I hope. But, I mean, I agree with what Jane says, that this is a sideshow. But generally, as far as the chilling effect is concerned, I think we ought to remember that chilling is a tried and tested method of preserving things. And I do think that sounds very flip. But what I mean is that if newspapers were to take a slightly more chilled approach to the way they treat news and think less about what they can do and more about what they should do, perhaps they might win back the trust of readers in an age when the internet is going to become increasingly a jungle and a place where you cannot rely on any information, and integrity means nothing whatsoever. At the moment, I think integrity means nothing whatsoever in certain newsrooms. But on the internet, it's certain that there is no such thing.
Okay, so let's just pause before we round up and see, take those votes again and see whether an hour and a half of great discussion has actually changed anybody's mind about anything. So get your pads out, and if we can try again. Vote 1 if you're in favour of statutory regulation, 2 self-regulation, 3 if it's independence or something else that matters, or 4 if you still don't know. There's more people voting this time round. Okay, I think we're there. All right, so we're still pretty much the same picture. Let's just compare it with last time if we can. Okay, so slightly more people in favour of self-regulation. So I think Chris and Ian will be pleased with that. And actually more in favour of statutory. So, okay, others we've taken people off the fence. Okay, basically we've got people off the fence onto one side or the other. So that's a good thing. Okay, the next question. Would Leveson's recommendations improve media relations and public communications? Yes, no, don't know, or don't care. Okay, so absolutely no, very strong there. I think that's ready to compare. Oh, okay, so a big shift from don't know to no. So we definitely help some people make up their minds this evening. That's very good. Okay, let's just get to the last question. Should the public relations industry or business support Leveson? Yes, no, don't know. I think we're about there. Yes, and how does that compare to last time? Okay, so we've definitely persuaded some people to get off the fence and make their mind up one side or the other. Most people think PR should support broadly Leveson, but they're in favour of self-regulation. Okay, that's it. A great discussion. Please join me in thanking our panel. It's been terrific.
Ladies and gentlemen, just a couple of thank yous from me and my team before you go. First of all, to all of you for coming tonight and making it so interesting and interactive. The video will be available tomorrow at Gorkana.com, and the debate continues at Gorkana on Leveson. It's been very interesting for those who've been following it. Chris Blackhurst, Ian Kirby, Graham Shear, Jane Wilson and Ben Fenton. And of course our chair, Professor Richard Sambrook, who steered us so skillfully through the issues. Thank you very much to you all.